You're listening to Tech Me Seriously with Sarah Tenisi, CEO of TenisiTech. Candid conversations with driven technology and business professionals who've always got something interesting to say.
Hi, I'm Sarah Tenisi, the host of Tech Me Seriously and CEO of TenisiTech. We're an IT services firm headquartered in California. I'm really excited to be continuing some of the IT leadership conversations that I started with Carlo Cacciatore a couple weeks ago. We've been working together forever, and this is a podcast about technology. And so we thought, let's start sharing some of our wisdom that we have with the masses. So here we are. Today, we're talking about managing the dip of the J curve. And so for anybody that's been through any kind of project or any kind of deployment or any kind of acquisition, you've certainly been on a ride on the J curve. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Welcome, Carlo.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. Excited to be here and talk about implementation and what we do every day.
This is the thing, right? I love this. I love this because let's start by defining the J curve. Do you want to kick us off with that?
Yeah, the J curve is really what we experience anytime we're implementing new tools, processes, services across the board and really changing how people work, right? And that's fundamentally what our goal is to positively impact how they work, make their day more efficient, make their tools easier to use. But no matter what, even if the end result is going to be a better, faster experience, more collaborative experience, there's a learning curve, right? And there's outage windows as these changes happen. There's sudden changes that happened. Even if you do all of the pilots, phase out all the groups, there's still a lot of change management required to, hold user groups' hands and bring them along for this journey. And depending on, I would say, the culture of whatever organization, some organizations are comfortable moving really fast and it's oftentimes not that big of a deal. And some organizations have been doing things the same way for, up to a decade sometimes, depending on, the type of company it is. And so it can be some serious management required to get these projects off the ground and then launch successfully and ultimately get them to that place that they want to be, leadership it has their goals set for and accomplishing all of that.
Will you talk about kind of the emotional ride that people go through on this J curve and kind of the emotional side of it?
Yeah. And I mean, I think we see different things from different levels of the organizations. Where like leadership might have a much more pragmatic or about the opposite, not a pragmatic
right
view of how this stuff should go. But typically, right, there's at the leadership level at a minimum, there's excitement, right? Because
when you start,
you're targeting outcomes. You're trying to accomplish your goals. And so like if we're implementing a new service that's going to, save 15% of their workforce time across the board and get, better reporting insight into what's happening day to day, they're going to be really excited to kick the project off, perform that initial spend and get things going. And then typically, right, you're detangling years and years of, potential technical debt. You're performing these pilots and, going through a pretty comprehensive testing phase. And more often than not, I think, technology can sometimes be oversold, right? And like, I think on the IT side, we have more realistic expectations on that. And so we're able to kind of cut off some of those misaligned expectations up front. But there's still like building specific for any environment, any company, and frustrations will kick in. Right?
That's right. That bottom of the J, right?
And it could be across the spectrum. Hey, you're moving too fast. You're moving too slow, right? Depending on the organization, you're being too thorough on testing. You're not being thorough enough. And, this needs to be more right for this user group. And there's a ton of stuff we do to mitigate this, right? You talk about enlisting friends of IT, some of the more technology savvy user groups in the company, right? Teams that potentially have more flexibility. And then you save, some of the highest risk groups for the end, think of your leadership teams, your finance teams, orgs like that. And we do our best to kind of carry that through from beginning to end and ultimately end up where companies want to go. And it's so satisfying at the end of a project, doing a retro 6 months, after, and really collecting the feedback of just how foundational and positive, these changes were at the end of the day.
And I think it's so important to talk about the J curve. And I feel like part of what I'm trying to do and what we're trying to do with our clients is normalize that experience, right? That total excitement at the new idea, the new process, the new service to, okay, this isn't quite as fun and groovy as we were hoping it was going to be for a lot of the reasons that you talked to that 6-month post. Let's see how we ended, which people should be way more excited. People should be more productive and really happy with the results of that project. If your IT team can pull that off, and it's really tricky, and we're going to talk about that as well. And I feel like it's only been in the last several years that we started really kind of normalizing that experience and talking about it, whether or not we're onboarding new clients, because that's a pretty significant project in and of itself, or starting a new project. And so I love that we're able to talk about this, because part of what I think our job is to try to manage that J curve. And so when you think about kind of that, and I want to talk about more specific examples later, you mentioned a couple of them already, like having a cheerleader in each time. But what are some of the other things that TenisiTech does to manage the dip of that J curve?
Well, I think that fundamentally, this comes down to so much more than technological aptitude, right? This isn't about the tools we're putting in place themselves and the configurations of
That's right.
This is really all about, project management excellence and like high touch communications and all of the high level change management steps required in between, and like the planning and that expectation setting that you spoke to, right? And so being able to, have those really effective communication channels where you are setting expectations up front, you're really outlining what this is going to look like in like the learning curve to be expected for this stuff, and performing great learning paths, right? Like providing those at the end of the day. You look at like obviously multi-threaded opportunities for our customers, employees to learn, right? Whether that's, lunch and learns where they can jump on a live call and do training, recorded videos for how to use the new tools or common workflows to, just your old school documentation and quick reference guides. And we try to attack it from all angles like that, right? So that, we know not everyone's going to join a lunch and learn, or not everybody read the email communication or one pager that you attached and look at the fact sheet. And so, I think I've always looked at it as our job is to make it as easy as possible. So like having all of those options available, as you are planning out. And there's always going to be people at the end of the day who ignore every last communication and
100%.
for reasons, right? Their jobs could be very laser focused, and like we have to do our best identifying those folks and like, still figuring out a way to support those changes.
And I think that's kind of the trickiest thing, because you're right. I mean, clear communication, expectation setting. I think that part of the challenge that IT teams have is that we really need to figure out the easiest path for end users to get into the new application or service or software program, whatever it is that we're doing. And I think a lot of people think, well, IT is just magic. Isn't your job super easy? Like, why do we even have to read an email on it? Can you talk a little bit about the complexity that goes into kind of building a user experience that is kind of lightweight, I would say?
I mean, I think that comes back down to our like the general approach of always trying to make workflow and tools as simple as possible, right? Back in the day, it was really easy to see over-engineered solutions, were just cumbersome to navigate, right? And part of that was the time, right? With older on-premise solutions that required many steps to get to where you needed to go. Today, with the SaaS tools in place, and I think the look and feel that those companies are targeting, there's a lot more opportunity to make that a simpler experience for teams and folks out there. But also we're seeing new waves of complexity now that we haven't seen before. Now that there's, an AI widget built into every one of these tools that are in place today or that we're rolling out. And now the first question is, how do we use, these new features? And some of them are super beneficial, and we want to get our arms around those efficiencies and opportunities. And as people know out there, some of them are totally useless and, I think complicate, what people are trying to do on a day-to-day basis. And so that's going to be, I think, the next, big lift across the board is what are we going to do with, all the native AI functionality built into these platforms?
It's kind of interesting because as we're talking about this, it's sort of occurring to me that not only there's like one side of the equation is the J curve. And for me, that's like the emotional experience that people go through during any type of project. And we're not even necessarily just talking about IT projects. This could be any project, right? And there's J curves across the board for all kinds of different things. It's kind of a super useful model. But as you start talking, as we've been talking about this, it occurs to me that it's not really just it's the J curve, but it's also about change management. And so when people are talking about change management, what are some of the things that you guys are thinking about as you start to deploy a project? I mean, is it as simple as having a really good project plan to follow, or what else goes into that?
I mean, it's definitely the project plan and being thorough in the steps on the technical side and the user experience side, right? To get to where you want to go and then what's going to happen at the end. But it's all of that communication in between as well, right? That's where it's like, it's so not a technical exercise at this point, right? It's how do you get things baked down into a language that, people will be receptive to in, the right size, bite-sized increments that, they can learn from in the midst of their day-to-day, right? Because no one's going to take a day off to, learn about a new feature that's out on their tools. So that's really I think a challenge, and where, working with a team that just has a long track record of doing projects and getting projects done makes a difference, because I know what it's like to have projects stall out and, run into those challenges, whether that's, on the technical side because of limitations met, or, on the training side and, getting buy-in on the customer end on, what really needs to happen for them to take on these new tools.
Well, and I think that that's kind of an interesting thing to explore, as well as when you think about, technical change specifically, right? There's kind of like, there's always these questions that arise at the beginning of a project. It's like, A, what tool should we buy? B, wait, should we build? Which you and I have pretty, I think, similar views on that. And then the third thing is, do you actually know how people are using tools and what other tools are deployed within the environment? So does the new tool fit with the existing environment? And so I feel like there's all these different exercises that an IT team has to go through that really are invisible to most people, and they should be, right? That's the whole idea, is IT should be invisible. But I feel like there is this like idea that it's magic and it's easy, like really, let's talk about like a mail migration and kind of how those feel for people. And maybe that's a super old example. I mean, your AI samples are probably better, but
I have a good example.
yeah, great. Let's talk about some examples
that I'm seeing for myself.
Okay.
Back, and then is definitely a conversation and stuff that we do with customers. But a really common one right now, and it's funny how simple it is screen recording on web conferencing, or recording of web conferencing and the automation of note taking across web conference meetings, right? And we use a variety of platforms, right? Like Zoom was a big one out there, but you have Google Meets, people have Teams, there's still some odds and ends out there that you might connect to a bridge to. And standardizing on the tool that's going to record, for your team and take notes has been a challenge. And I know for myself, I have other third-party note-taking tools like Notion I use personally. It's not a standard TenisiTech product, and it's trying to record all my meetings now and take automated notes. And we have another tool that's doing that, and we've tested a few. And there's like, how many places is that, trying to happen now? It's kind of similar to when chat rolled out, a handful of years ago, where that became really, really common. Pretty much every platform tried to have chat built in. And it's like, you look at Zoom was trying to have chat built in, and everybody was already on, Teams or Slack. And we just don't need another place to try to communicate. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing that with web conferencing. And so understanding the proliferation out there, who's using what, right? Because I think that's kind of a challenge up front is people are used to the way they work. And like you have one team on one tool, a couple people on another. You're trying to standardize across the board and get that built out and make it a seamless change for everyone is a lift. There's a big discovery piece that goes into it. There's a, build out of the tools so that all that data is centralized and you can report on it. And then how are we going to use it and save everyone's time? It ends up feeling like I'm wasting more time now chasing down, the way these different tools are trying to work until it's, simply built and standardized across the board.
I mean, so much just came up for me when you were talking about this simple example, right? Because there is a lot that goes into the different examples. It's like, what are you comfortable with? But then I started thinking about shadow IT and how you stop.
Yeah.
Right? How do you stop people from using all the different tools? I think Chat GPT has been one of those tools that employees are using, but maybe customers are asking their vendors to not allow their employees to use those tools when it comes to supporting them. There's so much that we're going to have additional episodes on, but it's funny because you even take a simple example like your web conferencing and notes transcription and all of that, which could be a super powerful tool. And, when we start doing AI episodes, I think that we'll be talking about that for sure. But on the other hand, there's something as simple as, when you onboard an employee, they have their own J curve that they're going to go through. Because again, they've got this project of starting at a new company. And what about things as simple as, are you going to be assigned a Mac or a PC, or do you allow people to change? That's a perfect example of this J curve that we're talking about, right? And so it's funny because I think what IT people are constantly figuring out how to do is to help people be more productive. And so in any iteration of any project, there's all these different use cases that you're talking about. And I mean, that's why the planning is so important with these things.
And I think that those examples that we both just mentioned and the example of, the companies that you potentially think would be least impacted by the J curve, right? You think startups, heavy technical engineering teams across the board who really feel like they need little help from IT. Those are often the companies with the greatest amount of shadow IT, the biggest variance in tools. And what I think leadership at the end of the day keys in on and ends up caring about is a wildly larger amount of spend, right? When each group and team have selected their own tools, we've gone into companies that, just have such a proliferation of SaaS tools that they weren't really clear that they were spending licenses on. And if they had consolidated, those platforms into, the best use case across the board, there's a ton of savings on the table for that.
It's kind of interesting because that I think is a really good example. I mean, it's interesting because we still will go into companies and see both Microsoft 365 and Google Workplace.
Yeah, all the time. All the time. Because teams love Excel, right? You talk about a finance
Teams love Excel.
Needs Excel, and then you talk about a sales team that's been using Google forever, and that's just what they do. And trying to bring both of those worlds together can be a challenge.
Well, and I think what's so interesting about that is if I kind of focus on the idea of J curve and in a company that's running both of these kind of the two productivity platforms that people are on today, it's funny because I feel like most of those people are hanging out at the bottom of the J curve because they're not even really able to communicate across the organization yet. And so I think that that's part of why the IT hat in those scenarios is really important. And I mean, even the IT leader hat, right? In those scenarios, because you're going to be having conversations with leadership to kind of try to get a company to settle on one or the other. And I mean, what are some of think about hanging out in that J curve if you're not finishing a migration project, which would include what other tools? I mean, I don't want to pontificate the whole time, but where do you see that challenge? Because I think that's something that a lot of people are dealing with today.
I mean, that's what you spoke to, needing an IT leader at the table, right? Who can really, I think, have the authority to drive those conversations, right? And we run into that issue, not all the time, but definitely sometimes where, we don't necessarily get the leadership level buy-in to force, different teams to the table to come together and solve some of these problems. And sometimes teams are okay limping along, right? And it's not a leadership level priority to solve some of those problems because they have other bigger business problems they're trying to solve. And I don't think that those organizations fully understand, I think, the inefficiencies are, under the covers and, are potentially costing quite a bit in expense. And that's our job, right? As IT leaders, when we look at these tools and we look at how people work, and we need to be able to tell that story, right? And not just anecdotally, but, through the data that we collect and evaluate. I think that's where an experienced partner really can drive a lot of value.
Part of what I find so interesting about even this example of different tools being used in different teams, whether or not it's exactly shadow IT or managed by IT, is that it strikes me that as we all enter into this, realm of AI, where people are looking at how to leverage AI and are looking at how to leverage it within a company, not just a large language model chat feature, but like legitimately thinking about how are we going to use these tools to help automate and kind of work our processes. It feels like it ought to be kind of a requirement that people are using the same tools. So I feel like there's going to be a lot of change for those companies using different tools coming up.
For sure. And definitely in the case where you're dealing with sensitive data and, compliance standards where that needs to be fully evaluated and policy needs to be set around it. And, when you start talking about customer data, personal data ending up in these systems, like typically IT needs to be able to account for where that information's going, the ingress, egress of that data, through the organization. So that's going to be huge.
100%. So do you have stories of disruption or adjustment and how, basically what I'm looking for is how to manage the bottom piece of that J curve. And I feel like maybe the more specific, the better, but I don't know if you have any of those off the top of your head.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one we saw a few years ago that you alluded to was the productivity email migrations that were really commonplace as people were moving away from, their on-premise servers. I will still run into those every once in a while.
All the time.
Yeah, where I'm convinced every year that that's the last one of those projects I'll ever do. But we still run into them. And as we talked about, right, it's really trying to not change too much at once, right? Like the back end oftentimes is changing, foundationally. Huge shift in the back end, but the front end doesn't necessarily need to have that much change. At the end of the day, you're still using email, you're still using your, Word, spreadsheet.
Calendaring, yeah.
Yeah. And so trying to make the changes bite-sized and phasing out, maybe the feature sets, right? Like a lot of times what we'll do is we won't roll out the entire platform and all of the modules. We'll start with, kind of a baseline and then build up and ramp up the features available. And then, make it so not all of that training needs to happen at once. You do the required training for, that subset of features, and then you build on it, throughout the quarter and throughout the year.
I want to pause on that point because we've even done projects where companies have asked us to come in and do, a project review or postmortem on a project that didn't go well. And I think what you said is kind of key. In order to kind of ensure a successful project, you make it bite-sized. And I think like that's something that, if people don't get anything out of this except that, like that I think would be a big win in terms of an understanding that you can't change everything at one time. And do you remember that company that I'm talking about and all the stuff they changed?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's bite-sized from a feature perspective, workflow perspective, like we talked about, and it's bite-sized from a user population perspective, where you don't want to cut over the entire
I
company.
mean, I just want to highlight because they were going to standardize on M365, which, we do a lot of that work, and they had kind of gone at it their own, and they changed email, changed calendaring, changed conferencing, changed voice, and changed, I think that was basically it. But their entire productivity stack at once. And then said to us, "Do you know why it didn't work out?" And it was like, yeah, I mean, bite-sized.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, that's why, as I mentioned, we start with the entry point of those platforms, and then we'll expand it, and definitely, go team by team at a large organization. So, we're collecting feedback on the training material early on. The pilot group, the first user groups are going to let us know what's working, what's not working in our training. We'll be able to adjust and build upon that as we go. So when you're at the halfway point, it's a pretty smooth sailing process, right? The first couple groups are just
Yeah.
those are more willing participants who are going to be more honest and flexible, and then as you go, you can move into those harder, I think, user populations.
One of the things that came to mind is you were talking about kind of understanding your end users and the people that are using the tools is really knowing the team that you're working with. And we kind of talk about this a lot internally, and when the occasion arises, and those occasions are, hey, our IT is down. We don't know why. Can you jump in? And so, I mean, what is understanding those user groups? Like, how key is that in having a successful project? And then talk about a little bit of like when it's not ideal, i.e. the emergency IT or just the project focused work. Like, talk about the relationship side of it and how important that is.
I mean, that's definitely why project managers, IT leaders, they have to be connected with the different department leaders, managers, folks on the ground. And, I think the biggest challenge is just having those communication channels open, right? And being able to be, someone who could bridge that gap and understand what's happening on the ground and be available to collect feedback, right? And so, like, so many times I've seen issues with projects and, with partner companies where the biggest problem is just that communication piece, where like the team on the ground doesn't know who to talk to in IT, or vice versa, right? IT doesn't know who to work with on the ground, and they're not being proactive enough in driving that connection, right? And it doesn't happen for you, right? As somebody who's performing these large implementations, that's not going to be handed to you on a silver platter. There's, oftentimes quite a bit of gentle persistence required.
Gentle persistence. I love it. We should coin that term. Well, and I keep thinking about like this, idea that, and you just said it's not going to happen for you, right? Like, I feel like one of the primary kind of exercises in planning a project is really understanding who's impacted, your various departments that are impacted. And I feel like that takes time. And a lot of times you'll have somebody call us and say, hey, we only want you to do a phone project. And it's like, okay, well, that's going to probably take, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks, depending on the size of a company, maybe longer if it's a bigger company, to actually do that discovery, right? And I feel like people are like, just get it done. Don't you just wave your magic wand? And I feel like that team building piece of it, that discovery piece, and knowing who we're impacting and what their jobs look like is so important, that it always feels uncomfortable when somebody says, come do a project, and we don't like that discovery phase.
Yeah, it's very, very hard to find success with a company that I think isn't willing to, make themselves available for those conversations. I don't think any IT change, operations change happens in a vacuum, right? And so you can't be siloed, through that process. You really need buy-in from the top and have that be driven across the organization.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something we explore. Like, should TenisiTech be a firm you call just for a project? And that's tricky for us, right? Because we love doing projects, but what happens if we don't know the people?
Yeah, that presents, I think an initial set of challenges. And there's always an additional challenge about being kind of 1 foot in with an organization. You might not be responsible at that point for the storytelling and the education of why we're doing this.
Right? How could you if you're a hired gun?
Yeah. And so, like, I think a big piece of any of these large implementations is sharing that the why, the goals of these projects, right? Like, what are we ultimately trying to do? And most of the time, it's to drive the customer experience at the end of the day, right? Like, it always comes back to the customer or the clients that your company supports. And like, we're trying to do a better job at supporting them and showing up for them and performing, their services, right, that they're doing. And so that's an important piece of this too, is that storytelling element of, the reason that we're moving in this direction, and ultimately what the end product should look like and how it's going to benefit the customer.
And how it's going to feel using it, right? And I think that we cannot, I feel like, highlight that as much. Like, that's not technical.
Yeah.
That's about relationship building, storytelling, understanding people's jobs, understanding their day-to-day, and kind of how the tools will impact that. And so it's funny that in such a technical conversation where you're talking about navigating the J curve and what does change management look like, a lot of the time it boils down to communication, which is kind of funny for IT.
In the company mission and their values, right?
Yeah.
And how they're aligning with that and how they're trying to achieve that.
So what does an unsuccessful project look like or feel like?
I mean, we've hit some of the examples. I think the biggest one is getting buy-in on discovery. So like those internal teams that are going to undergo the change, being available to navigate the discovery process and, understand how things work today and how they want it to work, getting that time up front. And then, next to that is that leadership level, I think, direction setting and
100%.
I think the level of, how prescriptive they're willing to be with the teams below them, right? And,
yes,
letting them know, like, this is what we're doing and this is the direction and the goals that we are going to go achieve this quarter.
And those conversations are super important. I think about leaders that we've talked to. We've said, okay, there's two approaches. We could do a phased approach or we could rip off the Band-Aid, right? And both are okay, right? Both are totally acceptable ways to do rollouts. But are you going to have the support from the leadership side to say, yeah, it's going to be painful for a couple of weeks and we're going to get through it? And I think that leadership buy-in is super important for that too.
Yeah, that's a really, really big one for sure.
Right? Because otherwise I feel like projects could languish, where you're like a year into a project and you're like, okay, we just need to say no. Like, no more feature updates, no more new stuff. We have to complete this piece of it right now.
Yeah. And the lingering it's a lot of times it can be lingering teams that are hesitant or unavailable. And, those folks just have to move.
And then a successful project on the other hand.
Yeah, I mean, that leadership level buy-in being there, I think, general interest in the improvements across the company. And then obviously like on the execution side, right? Having your T's crossed and your I's dotted and actually following the project plan. It's one thing to build a great plan. It's another thing to, be precise with the steps along the way. And
true.
That is, it all has to come together. For sure, for that to be successful.
So it's kind of interesting because we talk about the J curve, then we talk about change management, and then we talk about communication. And that's so much what it is. And then within that change management piece is that iteration of technical scenarios, right? Well, we did this team and this is what we learned. And you're right, by that midpoint, it should be kind of smooth sailing. You can start to see that J curve recover, right? Toward the side of productivity, I guess I would say. But I love talking about this because it feels technical, but it really is more about communication and how we talk to each other. And so I totally appreciate your thoughts on the J curve. And for all those people doing projects out there, technical or not, remember that that's a very natural experience. Excitement, dread, better, excitement again, right? Towards the end of it. So any kind of closing thoughts as we wrap this one up?
I mean, I would just say like the other big thing that you're looking for when you're going through this is having folks that are excited to do the work, leading it, right?
Good point.
I think that is something that's a difference maker. So if you do have internal teams who are driving these efforts, ensuring that this is, what they want to be working on, at the end of the day, could make a big difference.
I mean, That part's huge, right? IT does not exist for IT's sake. We've got to have our business partners within an organization driving change 100%. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to the next episode with Carlo Cacciatore.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for having me.